ahead and get started. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Vidya Murthy. I am in charge of operations at MedCrypt. This is a webinar hosted by MedISAO in conjunction with MedCrypt, and it's to talk about learnings from medical device vulnerability disclosures for device manufacturers. Great. So the team that is joining you today, as mentioned, my name is Vidya. I used to work for Becton Dickinson, a large device manufacturer, helping with some of the personal health information management issues that we were trying to figure out. Joining me is Seth Carmody. Seth, you want to say a quick 2 words?
Hello, I'm Seth. Nice to have you guys. Thanks for joining.
Great. So Seth was formerly at the FDA and had a heavy hand in working on the pre-market cybersecurity guidance.
Thanks, Vidya.
Axel, you want to say a couple words?
Yeah, Axel Worth, Chief Security Strategist here at MedCrypt, and prior to that, 12 years at Symantec with focus on healthcare security and compliance, and especially medical device security.
So just to make sure we can appropriately refine our narrative, we are obviously from different backgrounds, ranging from manufacturer, regulator to vendor. Would love to see a bit about who is in the audience so we can make sure we are sufficiently meeting the needs of the folks on here. And as polling results are coming in, I see a healthy majority are from the manufacturer space, as expected. We got a couple researchers in here and a couple of others. Ooh, I wonder what that is. Great. So to really get things started, I want to spend a little time talking about why we're doing this. So for those of you who have kind of been following the MedCrypt journey, we've been going through the ICS-CERT vulnerability database for a few years now. And it started off with this desire to try to figure out how we could quantify the position that device manufacturers were in when it came to cybersecurity. And we didn't want to do it off of anecdotes necessarily. We were trying to find actual data that could be useful. And as we searched around to try to find what could actually be sufficiently tenable to look at, we found the vulnerability disclosures to be a decent representation of progress. And I know there are several arguments for why it is not the perfect representation, but it was one of the few that actually had data behind it. So what started off as just an initial intrigue of what are we going to see when we pull all this data together has kind of become this interesting trend that we've been following for about 3-4 years at this point. And our whole methodology is effectively, let's be as transparent with the data as possible. So for those who have seen the white paper, in it, there's a link to our public facing version of the data. We encourage folks to slice and dice it and really kind of look for additional insights and things that you've seen. But we really wanted to take this data and try to find as many facets as possible and try to see what we could glean from trends and emerging behaviors that we're seeing by device manufacturers or in vulnerabilities that we're actually seeing disclosed. And so what we found, quite predictably, is there's a large inflection point around when the FDA's Postmarket Guidance came out. And so since that guidance has come out, we've seen kind of this exponential growth in rate of increase. And the reason we've broken it out into 2 is the way advisories work is you have a single advisory typically, and within that you can have a multitude of vulnerabilities. A single vulnerability can apply to the entire advisory or it can apply to a subset of it. But there's kind of this relationship where one advisory could have a many vulnerability respected in that. And in that sense, we wanted to get a sense for both because both numbers can tell kind of a unique story on their own. And so when we looked at this, what initially started out as a somewhat lower level of 0.95 vulnerabilities per month has now post FDA guidance coming out grown by about 6-fold into 4.8 vulnerabilities per month. And the reason I focus on that vulnerability measure is because that kind of one-to-many relationship can sometimes bring a little bit of a skew if you're only looking at advisories. But it's evident, right? They're seeing this increase in rate. and how advisories are being released.
So I just want to look at a couple of other things here that came out of the data. Among it, the device type with which the vulnerabilities are associated. And I think we see two underlying drivers here that led to this particular curve we have in front of us. One is obviously the number of advisories pretty much goes with the volume of devices in a hospital, right? If you work in an HDO, your most common device is an infusion pump, followed by patient monitors, and then it goes down the curve. So clearly those devices have more advisories associated with them, but also because advisories are still driven largely by independent security researchers, these devices are easier accessible. We know of researchers buying them on eBay and obtaining them through other sources. So it's easier to get a hold of an infusion pump or a patient monitor as compared to, for example, a CT scanner or other piece of capital equipment. And we're not showing, all device types here. There's a long trailing end with, one or two of like beds and anesthesia devices and many more. Again, we're not listing here. Next slide, please. I already touched on the role of security researchers. So the total of advisories that have been issued since 2013, we see that 31 did not reference a researcher, but 73, meaning 70%, did reference a researcher. So that clearly highlights what I just mentioned, that the security researchers are a very important part of this vulnerability discovery and disclosure ecosystem. And that is a trend that is still true to the present day. Next slide, please. Another thing we derived from the data was we looked at the advisories and compared the time before the FDA post-market guidance and after the FDA post-market guidance to see to what extent patch recommendations were included in the advisory. And there's a pretty drastic change that prior to FDA guidance, really only in half of the cases, just over half, was there a patch or software update recommendation included in the advisory, and now it's actually more than 75%. So that would indicate that advisories, the quality of the individual advisory is getting better, that the manufacturers include more useful information that helps then the user of the device, the healthcare organization, to mitigate the given vulnerability. Admittedly, a patch is not the only possible mitigation, but I think it's by far the most common, and therefore I think this is a decent analysis and decent conclusion that again the number of patches included in a disclosure and therefore the quality and the benefit of a disclosure to a healthcare organization is indeed increasing since the FDA market guidance. Next slide, please. Thank you. So another thing that was also quite interesting is we looked at the number of medical device manufacturers that have made a disclosure. And clearly making a vulnerability disclosure is an indication of a functioning security process. It is not an indication of poor software quality, but it is an indication of functioning processes. However, the absence of an advisory by a given manufacturer does not indicate that they have a perfect security process, nor does it indicate that there are no vulnerabilities in the device. So if you look at some of the numbers, and if you go to the white paper we published, it has more detail on it. But if you look at the top 40 medical device manufacturers by revenue, 17 have now a published vulnerability disclosure process, and 16 have actually published disclosures. So 5 of those 40 top 40 manufacturers actually don't have computerized or connected devices. So 35 do, and again, roughly half of those have a vulnerability disclosure process and have disclosed vulnerabilities. But that also means that 19 of the medical device manufacturers that have connected devices in their portfolio have never made a disclosure. And again, I don't think that means that they have perfect products, nor does it mean that they have no vulnerabilities. Another interesting thing that came out is that of the 92 advisories that have come out since December 2016, meaning since the FDA Postmarket Guidance, half of those actually came from 3 companies alone. So clearly there is still a big difference in maturity and a big difference in willingness to actually make disclosures, as indicated by the fact that, again, 49 out of those 92 disclosures came from 3 companies alone. And we have a deeper analysis in the white paper if you're interested. Next slide, please. So what does actually all of this mean for the medical device manufacturers? Clearly, there's regulatory pressure, and Seth will talk about it in a moment. But there's also customer pressure, right? Customers are demanding security. Customers are now testing devices, and Mayo Clinic started that a number of years ago, that they took devices out of clinical operation and basically started pen testing them, and the results were quite sobering. And also Mayo Clinic started the trend of including security requirements, excuse me, in their procurement contracts, which is now being adopted by more and more hospitals. And there's actually now a hospital consortium working on standardized security contract language that I believe will be published fairly soon. What does it mean for the manufacturers, for the vendors? That the sales cycle is now extended. In fact, this particular vendor here stated that of a 6-month sales cycle, 3 months are being spent getting through our team, meaning answering security questions and addressing security concerns. So with that, I'll pass on to Seth.
Yeah, just to set the stage a little bit. So, I guess the inflection point is 2016, both the draft and final version of the Postmarket Guidance for the management of cybersecurity risks in a post-market sense came out. There was a couple of sort of industry historical momentum type things that were happening that we were observing that really we worked towards and instantiated in policy to drive home how cybersecurity was different for medical devices. So we're looking at 2 things. One is that in the manufacturing space, the way we minimize uncertainty and quantify risk really gets down to sort of, in part, the control of quality of parts, right? So how we focus on how an individual component functions was really critical, and quality is a huge component of any medical device manufacturer. And in that quality defects were essentially shameful, right? That no manufacturer wanted to be producing, defective components in their devices, which then could trigger downstream field failures. But the inevitability of engineered systems, that there's always defects, right? And that the same is true for software in not only just sort of run-of-the-mill bugs that impact feature and function, but that some subset of those are then essentially vulnerabilities, weaknesses in the system that can be taken advantage of by an adversary. So there needed to be this wholesale change of thought process around vulnerabilities are expected by your regulator, which is one of the key messages, and that it's not necessarily the presence of them, although yes, we should work to reduce the number, volume, severity of them pre-market. That it's really about what you, no matter what you do, you only can minimize them, not get rid of them. So it's more important, it's equally important to put into place processes which then take care of them once a device is in the field. So there's a number of problems with this, which we won't go into on the webinar today, But basically, how do we get a policy together that starts to incentivize that type of behavior? One of the major revelations that I had during my time at the FDA was that, one, as an industry, we weren't very good at patching because we weren't generally used to fixing things in the field, right? That focus on quality was really about minimizing risk pre-market, and that post-market was just a thing that happened and we would deal with if it came up. But we know that vulnerabilities are part of life. It's always going to be a continuous effort, which meant that, one, we have to be thinking and looking for stuff that's happening in the field that we might not be aware of. So how are you intaking information? And then two, that you have the processes in the house to actually deal with that information, right? Not only to process the information, decide what to do, but then when you decide what to do, that you can actually do it, right? So if it ends up in a patch, right, that you actually have to go through V&V and all the sort of regulatory hurdles, and then get that out. And then part of the policy too was to make sure that there was minimized regulatory burden, basically. So you see in the document that there's sort of a bifurcation of policy. It said, hey, we expect routine updates and patches for things that are just sort of security related. And then for the safety issues, we expect people to move fast. Like, how fast is fast enough when there's a safety issue? There's no good answer, so move as fast as possible. So there was this 30 and 60-day tier that was put in place. In that 30 and 60-day tier, there was some incentive structures baked in, basically, in the patient safety case, where we wanted people to fix things fast, right? So there's the timing tier. That there couldn't be anything wrong, meaning that nothing has happened. There's a lot of caveats with that in terms of detection. But then thirdly is this idea of active participation in ISAO. I think the general sort of response to the ISAO concept at this time, now we're talking like 2015 and 16, was, what the heck is an ISAO, right? And as a policymaker, you're charged with making things clearer, not muddier. And I think sort of the double-edged sword here with the ISAO concept was FDA is like, oh, well, we think this is good. We don't necessarily know concretely what it means. We're going to put it in policy and sort of we think it's generally good. There's some laws on the books for it, including the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015. We think that the market will figure out ways to make this work and be beneficial and deliver value overall. And if you met those three criteria, nothing's happened, timely response, and then active participation in ISAO, the agency was exercising enforcement discretion on reporting under 21 CFR 806, which is the reporting of corrections and removals to the agency. So a little bit of nuance in policy there, but overall, the FDA knew that cybersecurity was different. We needed to make a policy that sort of shoehorned cybersecurity and all of its continuous nature into sort of static regs, which was really the challenge. But I think in general, it was a good first step forward. Certainly looking forward to a revision of that post-market guidance document after they tackle the pre-market one. Next slide, please. So I think I covered sort of the weirdness of the ISAO feature, like the feature set that, people are like, what is this? What value does it bring? And it was really kind of the forward-leaning thinking of the FDA at the time is like, well, we think that it delivers value. There are organizations that exist today, like I guess it was the NHISAC at the time, now HISAC, the ICS-CERT under DHS, and now CISA, that were roughly kind of ISAOs, but the idea, I think, was at a national policy level is that we needed to, one, make information sharing routine, that there would be no regulatory ramifications of participating in information sharing. The information sharing in general was good. We had borrowed a little bit from other industries, say like the financial sector, and sort of sharing more sort of figuring out how to share sensitive information like vulnerabilities at the time. But what we found was in the beginning stages of these ISAOs that manufacturers would share sort of best practices, right? Like, well, what's your security organizational structure look like? How are you handling this? What's your process for that? And we thought that that was very helpful. But in terms of sharing, like, I guess dirty laundry or vulnerabilities specifically, that was more of a higher order edge. So I think the agency was giving people credit for participating disclosing through ICS-CERT. And that's, I think, why we're sort of here today, right? We see the overall increase, right, that it was viewed as good and sort of table stakes for manufacturers to participate in ISAOs, whether it was MedISAO, which wasn't a thing in 2016, or participating as ICS-CERT as a pseudo, is it a approximation of an ISAO, and disclosing through that organization. So it's really interesting to see the ISAO organizations today. I think there's and the vision for MedISAO is that we provide evolving services for this industry. So I'm really excited to think about what is in store for MedISAO. Next slide, please. Yes, predictions. Cool. So let's talk about some things that we observed and what we could expect in the future. One of the, I was front row center at the FDA for WannaCry, which was obviously a internationally healthcare vertical affecting exploit. I called it the NSA level digital pathogen. It was designed to be maximally affected and then wielded in the hands of whomever for whatever purpose. I think we've seen a handful of attacks since then. SolarWinds and the Exchange server supply chain attacks come to mind. We've also seen a broad assortment of sort of pseudo theoretical, researcher-driven, broad impact vulnerabilities. Thinking about Urgent 11, and I think what was it this week? There's always something of the week or the month. It's like REC. I got to get on these naming committees. They're just I don't know who names these things, but they're awesome. There's just this continual drive to improve critical infrastructure cybersecurity. Researchers are a primary component of that. They're obviously going to look for the most maximally impacting vulnerabilities that are higher up on the supply chain, and that means that medical device industry as overall has to know how to be poised to respond to a vulnerability that may impact your entire product portfolio, not just the device itself, but all the supporting infrastructure on down to the device. So if we look at who's poised to do that, one of the first check boxes, I guess, or one of the first steps to success is, well, do you have a coordinated disclosure policy? Well, you might not think, well, yeah, anybody can slam some words together and put them on the web, but what the FDA expects is that backing that public disclosure policy is process, right? A demonstrated value. Somebody has gone through the trouble of basically aligning your organization, people, process, technology to deal with security information. And today we see, only 14 of the top 40, basically have a coordinated disclosure. Is it 14 of? So basically that manufacturers are evolving in the way that they disclose vulnerabilities, from, say, keeping it internally to having coordinated disclosure policies on their website to actually putting together product security web pages, and this is what this statistic is referring to, and publishing data on their website, sort of out of band of the ICS-CERT, or in conjunction with ICS-CERT and other like FDA advisories, which is really a good sign, and we expect that to continue and increase as we see broad impacting vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. Something near and dear to my heart, the root causes I'm always interested in. I think that the question is, for me, is there's sort of two angles. One is, if I sort of frame it in the OWASP 4 questions of threat modeling, the last one is, how do we know we did a good job? This statistic, so there's CWE information published with, I think all vulnerabilities that are published generally, I think in my experience, I see CWEs associated with that tells us something about the root cause of where those vulnerabilities come from. And I think that is the key piece of information, right? So if in fact I do have code defects and that's where sort of post-market friction is happening, what am I doing internally to reduce the amount of code defects that are happening? Is it training of coders? Is it in terms of how you structure your coding and development teams? Is it that you get certifications for your coders, like secure coding practices and things like that, like or encryption? Like, is it that you didn't do any, right? Is it that you did something and it wasn't quite robust or complete, or there were defects in the implementation? These are the types of questions that start to allow us to say, are we getting better, for one? And that's sort of the question that we asked here, and the difference between you see the delineation between root causes based on the era, I guess the era of disclosures, I would call it, the eras. Are we getting any better? And if we, it's hard to say yes or no, but basically you see the data here. I can struggle to say anything concrete about it because it's just there's not enough data within the ICS-CERT advisories. But what I encourage listeners to take home today is, can we get data? Where is the data that is allowing us to say we're getting better as an industry? Looking at these sort of broad root causes, I would expect that vulnerabilities would change over time, right? The root causes, like it may be encryption in terms of a CWE, but move from we don't have any to the implementation it was incomplete or something like that, or there was a defect in implementation, right? You would expect those types of trends. And that's just something that we can't pull out of the data, but we thought it might be useful to have this data available for folks so that they could take it and run with it. So I encourage you to go take a look at what we've found in each era for root causes.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add to that is it feels like a lot of these root causes are not highly sophisticated attacks, right? It feels like it's relatively straightforward user authentication issues or something similar to that. So to me, I think that's interesting.
Yeah, it's a good point, Vidya. Like when you look at, I think there's nothing more frustrating than sort of indicative of how much further we have to go as an industry when you look at this recent disclosures for recently cleared or approved devices that still have hard-coded credentials in them, right? And this gets to the sort of adequacy. So things that we've been thinking about both in MedCrypt and MedISAO and me personally is what does adequacy look like, and how do you judge that at scale, right? How does the FDA and other arbiters of security like a Mayo Clinic look at a device and say, hey, how do we quickly get down to whether there's hard-coded credentials or not, and then getting that anti-pattern feedback into the development team saying like, hey, look, we're going to allow friction downstream from these things and it's just a no-go. Why is it still there? So I think those are the types of insights that help. I hope that the industry can leverage that information and say, hey, like, how do we feed this information back into our organization and make meaningful changes?
Wonderful. And to that, I think we have another polling question now. There are very passionate arguments for both sides of this, but I am curious to hear what people think from the audience. Are vulnerability disclosures a sufficient reflection of a device's security posture? And I guess I'll pose a similar question to Axel, if you want to share some of your thoughts on what makes a disclosure insufficient when thinking about a device's posture.
I think that there are a number of factors obviously in play here, and I think for a disclosure to be useful, it has to be sufficiently specific, defining the device affected, the device version, sufficiently describing the risk so that the healthcare organization can analyze and understand what their exposure is, but then lastly also provide specific guidance on how to mitigate the disclosed vulnerability both in the short term as well as then also in the long term with a final implementation.
Yeah, I think unsurprising, we have unanimously everyone says no, it's an inadequate measure. So that begs the next question, right? What would be a better measure? Is there such a better measure? Does it exist? Or are we kind of stuck in this doom and gloom position? And Seth, I'd love to hear your kind of future gazing version of what you think would be better.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking about personally is, and giving credit to where it's due, right? Like the FDA embraced disclosure because it was viewed as a catalyzing sort of the process, procedure, technology, people that manufacturers needed to get in place to move on to higher order things, right? So the crawl, walk, run strategy, and I very much think that we're in that crawl phase. And I look at the idea that we have vulnerability information that goes to and is mediated by DHS, which is absolutely an essential function. We still need that. But then sort of these alerts go out and they're blasted out to the entire web, right? And the statistic that I would really like is how many of those advisories, whether it's in healthcare or other critical infrastructure or even general infrastructure, actually turn into action, right? And I think that is the key piece of information. I love the stat. We're getting better at patching. The patches available. That's what the FDA asked for. That is a major step forward for our industry. But if that is the primary risk reducer, it only reduces risk if it gets applied, right? So what are the inhibitors of it being applied? Is it because somebody didn't hear about it, or is it because that in order to apply it, we require a series of manual interventions, right? We require somebody to touch the device, and I think that type of sort of relay race chain is not sufficient, right? Necessary, but not sufficient for the speed and scale of attacks. So I would envision something in a future state where we're connecting technologies that can pass this information into the systems that we use to manage, say, an asset at a hospital, right? I think that is the next step, reducing manual processes, because in general, I don't think people have enough time, to deal with things that are out of band, like maybe an emergency patch, unless it's a really big deal. Then maybe it may be all hands on deck. But somehow baking in efficiencies in that relay race and chain to get patches that are now available, which is great, actually deployed in the field.
Axel, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about the patch process in hospitals. As you saw in our poll results here, people are pretty consistently saying the best measure doesn't really exist. Do you think patching or the availability of patches is a measure that could potentially be useful?
So to pick up what Seth was saying is that, we are where we are, right? So today, I think patching is still one of the most important things we can do from a security perspective. However, I would question whether that is sufficient. I think we need a different path forward. If you look at, for example, incidents like WannaCry, the NHS in the UK, which was pretty severely affected by WannaCry, they had 81 out of 230 some hospitals full or partially shut down by WannaCry. What was interesting is that their post-mortem analysis showed that actually the majority of systems impacted were Windows 7 or newer operating systems for which a patch had already been available. So in reality, I think patching as a security strategy that has been around in the IT space for many, many years, I don't think it is working there as shown by WannaCry. And using patching in a different space, the medical device security realm, is even more challenging due to complexity, due to ongoing care operations and so that it makes it even more difficult, not only for the manufacturer to release timely patches, but also for the healthcare organization then to deploy timely patches. So the simple question is, will we ever be able to patch fast enough and complete enough to become secure enough? And I think the answer is no. I think we need to look for a different path forward.
In that vein, it sounds like doom and gloom, but I feel like there is hope with things we can change. What can we change going forward, Axel?
Now you skipped one slide, right? We wanted to talk about the HHS data. Okay, gotcha. So this is a little step aside, and we need that slide, otherwise the next one doesn't make sense, right? So this is not talking about medical devices, but in general, the state of cybersecurity in the healthcare industry. Right, a quick reminder for those that don't know or forgot, since 2009 here in the US, HIPAA-covered entities need to report breaches affecting more than 500 individuals to Health and Human Services within 60 days of discovery. And HHS then on a regular basis publishes these breaches on what is called the Wall of Shame. So since 2010, since we have this mandatory breach reporting, we have pretty good data about the types of breaches and the overall trends. Granted, those are security incidents that involve the breach of data. So non-breach incidents are not included here. But nevertheless, I think we can see some interesting trends here. One is that not only is the number of reported breaches each year going up, but it's also going up faster. And we now have 3 times as many breaches as we had in the beginning in 2010. Also, what is interesting is that the majority of that increase since 2015 has been driven by hack-in and IT incident by that category. What used to be only 5% of all reported breaches back in the first couple of years is now 67%. So the single largest category. The second one is unauthorized access, which is also a category of malicious type of attacks, and that's now 22%. On the other hand, the category of theft, which traditionally was the theft of, let's say, laptops, external hard disks, is actually down. That used to be 66% and is now down to 6%. I would conclude that it's because we're doing a better job in encrypting these external or mobile devices. And at that point, if the data is encrypted, it is exempt from breach reporting. So clearly, it looks like that the malicious attacks, hacking, IT incidents are now taking over and are dominant, and incidental events like the theft of equipment, the loss of equipment, insider mistakes are now pretty much down to a low level. So now if you move to the next slide, kind of wrapping up here, and you know, what have we learned from all the data we looked at? One is, you know, we have had a decade, but we've had a decade of HHS breach reporting. We have had a decade of knowing that medical devices are insecure, yet there's no indication that the current approach and the approach we've taken over the last 10 years is actually improving the situation. In fact, it seems the opposite, right? Yes, we're spending the effort, but we are not gaining. ICS-CERT disclosures show us that the number of disclosed vulnerabilities continues to increase. The HHS data shows us that the number of breaches reported every year continues to increase. So what we're proposing is really that we need a fundamentally new approach, and we call it, you know, shift left. If you look at the device cycle of a medical device, what we're doing today is we're trying to secure medical devices, but also IT equipment, basically within the enterprise on the network, but to the outside of the device. And we try to solve security problems through procedural measures, like, for example, vulnerability disclosure and mitigation disclosures. And clearly, again, looking at the data, that does not seem to be working. And what we're proposing is this shift left approach that takes security and moves it to a point as early as possible in the life cycle of a device, right? Security needs to be designed into the device for it to be effective. And also, if you look at the cost created by security across the entire life cycle, if you invest early, your total cost will actually be lower. So with that, I think we are opening up for Q&A. So either we can unmute or we can use the Q&A feature to the left side of your screen.
Yes, I believe. Oh, there we go. We got our first one. Oh no, that's Seth answering. Sorry. If you have a question, I think just pop your name into the Q&A and we can unmute you. Otherwise, feel free to type out your question. Seth, maybe do you want to talk a little bit about the one you're answering in text here?
Yeah, so the question was about is there a collaboration, ISAO collaboration, and I'm taking the very broadest of definitions for ISAO collaborations. So certainly MedISAO and the other named ISAO, I think it's Sensato, have MOUs with the FDA and the HISAC, so there is collaboration there. And I know that the certs of all flavors, so ICS-CERT and US-CERT have a connection and relationship because they generally handle industrial control systems and sort of general computing. And so they have some handoff there. I didn't work there, so I can't speak specifically about it, but certainly that. And then I do believe US-CERT and probably the other flavors of CERT like ICS-CERT coordinate internationally, like CERT Japan and some of the European certs and things like that. So I do think there's a connection and collaboration. As far as a roadmap for ISAOs, I don't think so, but there is, and I'm forgetting the name of it at the moment. There's like an ISAO consortium, and they come out with like the standard on ISAOs. It's been a number of years since I thought about the name, so I blanked on it. But if there is a roadmap, I'm guessing it would be with that organization. It might be based out of Texas. I can't remember specifically. Yeah, so certainly there is some collaboration that goes on, and that's important. And I think you can probably find some resources on potential ISAO roadmaps if there is one from that. There's a ISAO consortium that puts out standards for ISAOs, and if there is one, it would be there. The other thing, Vidya, is I saw some stuff about hospital contracting, basically standardized contract language. I wanted to speak to that for a moment. And I thought I had just sent out text, but apparently I superseded the text limit and it just deleted it. I don't see it there. But standard contract language is really interesting. I see there's a group in the HSCC working on it. The thing that so I did some security economics research over 2020, and so the output from that is that that healthcare must consume security debt to deliver healthcare. And while their procurement and sort of contract language, I think is an important route to have people thinking about and working on, we need to reflect that in the end, even a Mayo Clinic, and I love the folks at Mayo, they've been great stuff, like, and they've made pen test devices, is that if push comes to shove and it's a Windows XP system, but it treats is pushing the envelope for some disease state in terms of treatment, quality of life, then that device gets procured and they manage the risk. And I think as long as that's true, as long as the model that an HSCC or other entity comes up with doesn't help to overcome that problem, then the effect of standardized contract language and procurement approaches will be minimal, which is just a reality of our situation. So I think that any model has to reflect the economic reality, and that is that healthcare has to absorb security debt. If given the choice between security debt and delivering healthcare, they have to choose the healthcare side. So how do we get both, right? Eliminate security debt or reduce it significantly while allowing healthcare practitioners to do what they do best, and that is deliver healthcare.
And that's a perfect segue to the next question we got here, which is that security is in fact a shared burden between healthcare organizations as well as device manufacturers. And while one can begin to alleviate that by designing security into their devices, what is really needed to move the needle instead of kind of these incremental changes to really get that shared responsibility?
Yeah, I think, from my perspective, I still think, and we see it in the data from ICS-CERT, right? We still see hard-coded credentials in the in design, right? And I think, that's a security ANSI pattern that makes it really hard to be and nearly impossible to defend in the environment, right? It just opens up a huge security hole, right? So I don't even think I would even take looks like Tom Floyd's comment that it's not a good start. It's absolutely essential, right, that we achieve some baseline or adequacy for security by design, which then facilitates allows HDOs to actually do their part, right, as sort of depth and security in depth. And this is sort of philosophy that I share with MedCrypt and MedISAO, is that you have to, security is always about defense in depth. If you rely on a single point of failure, network perimeter security, we know that those are fallible, right? And if we rely on those for security, and we don't have trustworthy devices that do authentication, that maintain integrity, confidentiality, right, availability under duress, then it's sort of like, well, that's the minimum, right? We have to get there first, and hard-coded credentials do not fit in that space. So really, the partnership comes from you've got to make a trustworthy device that then it can be hooked into a system. I guess we call it generally zero trust, right? And then you can deploy it in a hospital network such that the hospitals have a chance of actually securing it.
I think one thing we need to realize as the larger healthcare industry is that if we compete on meta cybersecurity, or between the buyer and the seller argue over who is responsible for cybersecurity, we will lose. Right? The enemy is not, from the hospital's perspective, the medical device vendor. The enemy, from the medical device manufacturer's perspective, is not the other medical device manufacturer. The enemy is your cybercrime group out of Ukraine, is your state-sponsored hacker out of North Korea or China. And again, I think we need to realize that if we start to compete over security or argue over security responsibility, it is predetermined that we will lose this battle.
And to a higher point too, is that what's really ridiculous about the entire situation is that the healthcare supply chain, this includes manufacturers and HDOs, speaking to your adversary comment, it's like, if there was a kinetic attack, right, that New York Presbyterian would not be expected to rebuff an attack from North Korea, right? Like armed forces on the border at New York City, ready to go pounce and then go attack New York Presbyterian. That's just ridiculous. But somehow in the cyberspace, right, individual organizations are left to, by their own resources and sort of business objectives to protect against nation-state attacks, which I think is wholly absurd, right? So I think even to elevate the shared responsibility, philosophy even higher, and I think we see this sort of emerging after the supply chain attacks of late, that we need an entire national approach, right? That the government has to help, tech sector has to help, Congress has to fund, regulatory authorities like FDA and CMS and all the other ones that are in the chain to help drive up our entire, maturity level. It's not just one organization, one stakeholder in the supply chain, it's everybody. So I look forward to that.
One of the questions I get when I talk to folks who aren't necessarily in this space is healthcare even a hostile environment? Like, why is this something that you're so concerned about? And I'd love to get your perspective in terms of, right, if this whole community has to come together to do this, are we really battling the same cause, and how do we better define what that is? If there are any more questions, please feel free to pop them in, or I will put up our emails. I saw there was one about where's the white paper. Hopefully that response went out, but our main website, we don't do the whole send me your email, so I send you the white paper. You can just download it. But feel free to drop us notes as you work through that, or if you have questions. Any parting thoughts, Axel or Seth?
Yeah, go ahead, Axel.
Thanks everybody for joining, and feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, I echo that too, Axel. One of the things that we need to think about is stakeholders in this industry is always ask the question, are we just skating to where the puck is, or are we? This is a hockey analogy for those who don't play hockey. Or are we pulling a Wayne Gretzky and skating to where the puck will be? I think subscribing to what has been done and doing what has been done or what we think is tried and true only gets us to where we are in terms. So I think in order to solve problems like how do we overcome the interface between, say, manufacturer and HDO, which is significant and to be worked on. What are the kinds of solutions that are skating to where the puck will be? So I think the idea that we can tie together and use technology and to do so is something that hasn't been explored. We sort of rely on manual process, and I just don't think that operates at the speed and scale that we need. So looking forward to the thought leaders in this space to evolve what we're currently doing so that we get a little bit better year after year.
Great, thank you both. Appreciate everyone's time and joining. We're going to try to do more of these webinars. So the next one is going to be in June. And as Seth alluded to, there are certain things that are supposed to be catalytic. One of those that's frequently discussed is a software bill of material. So we're going to spend some time talking about what actually makes that a difficult thing to work through and why are there challenges that we face as a collective community. Keep your eyes peeled for when we post the registration link for that. And as always, please don't ever hesitate to reach out for questions, concerns, if you just want to chat with us about what you thought. We would love to connect. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Keep well and stay safe.